Hey all you cool coral planula. My name is Mike. I'm one of the animal care specialists here at the Living Coast in Brookfield Zoo. Earlier this week, we celebrated World Oceans Day, and today is actually Jacques Cousteau's 110th birthday, or would have been his 110th birthday. So we thought it would be a great opportunity to talk about corals and coral reefs, and we'll do that by checking out our largest coral exhibit here at the Living Coast. So, one of my wonderful teammates just threw some food in there, some brine shrimp, so you'll be seeing the fish eat. But this exhibit here has been running since 2012. It's about 800 gallons, and there are 22 different species of coral in this exhibit and 16 species of reef fish. So as you can see, a coral is a colony of a whole bunch of things, and it is an animal, although it grows a lot like a plant, and we take care of it a lot like a plant. So here's a coral skeleton, if you can take a close look. So hard corals actually build a skeleton out of calcium carbonate, and you can see all these little pores. That's where an individual coral polyp lived. So the coral polyps are like building blocks. They're kind of like, think of them maybe as individual Legos, and to build a reef you put a whole bunch of Legos together to get a giant reef structure. But not all corals are hard corals. There's soft corals, gorgonians, things like that also contribute to the reef. But the hard corals are the animals that really build the structure that all of the diverse group of animals live on. So anyway, coral skeleton, living coral there. So these are acropora corals, the skeleton and the living one we're looking at right now. And you can see corals have different growth structures and patterns. So the acropora is a kind of a branching coral. Some of the others are plating corals. So we have like the orange one there is a Montipora. This blue one here is any kind of pora, so they grow in plates. So all their different growth patterns are a combination of factors. It's how they compete for light, and it's how they compete for space on the reef with all the other corals and things that grow on a reef. Corals, especially reef-building corals, but not all corals, have algae symbionts. So basically within their cells they have algae growing, and they provide a home for that algae, and the algae provides extra sugars and nutrients to help them build that coral skeleton that they use to create all that structure. So corals can grow in a kind of varying rates, but typically 1 to 8 inches or so per year is sort of the general gist of how quickly a coral can grow. So basically they can become quite huge, but it takes a really, really long time. They start off floating around in the ocean currents before they settle down and start as one individual polyp, like I said, like a Lego piece, one Lego piece settling before they build into these larger structures. So the different colors of corals are impacted by the different species of algae that they host, and also different chemicals that they have to help protect them from light. But they do need light to grow, and that's why they're in such a bright exhibit. They also, coral reefs, need to exist in warm waters, clear waters that sunlight can penetrate easily. So there's really only kind of a narrow band of places that corals can grow. All in all, there's about 2,500 different species of corals and about 8,000 or so species of coral reef fishes. The fish of the reef, you can see in this exhibit we have kind of some schooling fish. The little orange ones are called anthias. And they, like a lot of other fish, are hermaphrodites, so they all start off as females, and then at some point in their life the most dominant animal will become a male and then kind of guard that harem, and then when he eventually dies, the most dominant female will change sex and become the male of that harem. So you can see the male there, he's a little different. They're sexually dimorphic, which means the male and female look different. So you can see he's kind of reddish, he's got longer fins, and you can see he's ducking out of view. Keeping an eye on all the females in the exhibit. And then there are a lot of other fish in here. So there's a few different species of surgeon fish. Surgeon fish are really important because they eat algae. So it's helpful for us to have in an exhibit for them to eat algae, for us to help keep the exhibit looking nice. But it's incredibly important for herbivores to be on the reef because they help keep the reef structure clean and make it easy for corals to grow and find places to settle. So obviously Dory, the blue tang, is one of the species of surgeonfish that is an herbivore, but will eat a little bit of plankton and such. So yeah, reefs are incredibly under threat. They face a lot of challenges. So they are at risk from pollution, so that can be runoff, plastic, sediment. Like I said, they need to be in clear water, so if there's a lot of sediment coming from runoff, that can really be problematic for reefs. They also are threatened by development, so hotels and docks and things of that nature can dredge up and damage reef structure. Unfortunately, they also are affected by climate change, so increasing temperatures in the water actually cause them to expel the algae that they use to help produce the food that they need. So if the temperature increases, you'll hear people talk about coral bleaching. So that's what that is. That's them expelling all of the algae. So if conditions improve, they can usually recover from that, but if they don't, they eventually do lose that living tissue layer that's on the outside of the skeleton. And then ocean acidification, which increased CO2 in the atmosphere, can cause the ocean to be a little bit more acidic, and that slightly more acidic condition can actually cause the skeleton to break down. And make it harder for them to actually produce that coral skeleton. So reefs are facing a lot of threats. So it's important to learn about them and make the changes that you can make locally, because if you live around the Brookfield area, we have Salt Creek and such. All those rivers eventually lead to the Mississippi, which leads to the Gulf of Mexico, which affects reefs in the Caribbean, which are some of the most imperiled in the world. So the fish in this exhibit are sort of Indo-Pacific, or the fish and corals in this exhibit are Indo-Pacific, with a few things like those chromis, the ones that are kind of green and silverish, those are Australian. So maybe a slight Australian lean in this exhibit, but mostly Indo-Pacific grouping of animals. So doing things like using fewer chemicals in your yard that would run off into the local waterways is something that is a small change that you can do here that can make a big impact far away. Also reducing your use of single-use plastics. Those things can find their way into waterways and be problematic for reefs. So there's a lot of small actions that you can take here to really improve the condition for reefs that are far and far away. So.
Can you tell us what this fish is?
So that's a Banggai Cardinalfish. So that's one that isn't found in Australia. That's from the Banggai Islands. In the wild, they're actually endangered, but they are also invasive in some other places. So, and they're a popular aquarium fish for saltwater aquariums, and they do have they're mouth brooders, so they actually put their eggs in their mouth. The male will kind of keep them there until they hatch, and then the male will spit out all the babies, and they will have somewhat larger babies because of that little bit of extra parental care that the parents give them early on.
Are there any parrotfish at the Living Coast?
There are no parrotfish, especially not in a live reef exhibit. They can sometimes cause problems by nipping on the corals themselves. But an interesting fact about parrotfish, they have kind of a parrot-like beak, and they use it to rasp either at the rockwork around corals or sometimes corals themselves. And then after they chew up that calcium material, they actually poop it out as sand. So a lot of the wonderful, soft, tropical sand that you guys are walking on when you go on vacation is just parrotfish poop.
How many different species of fish are in this particular?
In this exhibit, I think it was 16 species of fish. Yeah, 16 species of fish, 22 species of coral.
Wow. Who's this guy right here?
That's a sailfin tang, and you can see he got a little startled when we moved towards him, and he raises up his fins there. That helps him look a little bit bigger for predators. Surgeonfish are also unique because they have a scalpel. They call them surgeonfish because they have a scalpel. So if you look right where the tail attaches to the body, there's a little blade there that they can use as a defense mechanism against predators, and that's why they're called surgeonfish, because they have that little blade that they can use. And that's what kind of unifies that family of fish.
Okay, so who's that bird screaming in the background?
So we are in the Living Coast. We're very close to the penguin aviary. So the animals you're hearing, I think, are the gray gulls, but there's also Inca terns if you hear kind of a chattering call in the background. So I think there's one Inca tern sitting where you can kind of view it. And maybe you can see some of the gulls bouncing around. In the back.
So you were talking about how the coral needs light in order to grow. What kind of light are we using?
So we're using metal halide bulbs above this exhibit, but they are making better and better high-powered LED bulbs that you can use on reef aquariums to kind of mimic that sunlight and give the corals what they need to be able to grow.
And I know we talked about last week, we talked about how the zoo makes its own salt water.
Absolutely.
How do we do that?
So we get salt, we order it from a vendor. It's called Instant Ocean, and that's pretty much what it is. It has all the components that we need to have all the minerals and salts and all the things that we need to make salt water that works for our corals and all of our saltwater animals here at the Living Coast. So you basically just mix it with fresh water. You try to use obviously the most filtered and pure fresh water you can, particularly with coral reefs. They don't do well with metals or things like that in the water, so you have to use a higher quality water. We use DI water here.
Someone wants to know if we have any Nemo fish, because we've got Dory.
We do. We have a couple, but I don't see them out and about. They like to hang out in the upper left-hand corner.
Yeah,
There's
I saw one earlier over here, but
yeah,
I don't
there's
see him
also a
now.
tomato clown that lives in this carpet anemone, although he's also not present at the moment. He's a camera shy, I suppose. But we do have a couple clownfish here, and then also at an exhibit up front in Living Coast, we do have some clownfish, some Ocellaris clownfish.
Oh, as soon as I brought the camera over, he ran away. But yeah, up in this corner.
So yes, so we do have them. Obviously, kids love them, and they're pretty fish. Aquarists love them too.
Do we have anywhere else in the Living Coast?
Yeah, up in the very front building, we actually have them with some bubble tip anemones. So it's one of the first exhibits that you see. Another beautiful living reef exhibit with some soft corals and such, and then the anemones that the clownfish live in.
What's your favorite coral?
I love this Echinocora. It's a huge specimen. It's been here for a long time, growing for a long time. Yeah, and it's got a good angle. So like this Montipora, like I said, we have to treat these like plants, even though they are animals. So make sure if you learn one thing, it's that corals are animals. But even though they're animals, we have to treat them like plants. So this Montipora, this plating coral here, I eventually have to kind of trim it down. It's getting a little big, so it's really pretty from the top, but not as pretty from the front view where guests obviously get to see it. So we'll have to go in there and trim it back and replant it a little bit to get a better look for guests. But it's nerve-wracking to break corals and replant them. So I've been putting it off a bit.
For the people who are joining late, what kind of creature? What kind of is coral animal or plant?
It's an animal. It's in the family Cnidaria, so it's related to anemones. It's related to jellyfish. They do have stinging cells. So obviously the polyps for these hard corals are pretty small, but they have stinging cells that they can use to kind of to eat their prey, very small plankton and stuff. They can kind of harpoon it and then pull it into their mouth. So they do have a mouth. It's just very, very tiny. Like if you look at the fake coral, or the coral skeleton, again, you can see all those little holes were individual polyps, and all these little kind of cups in the branching portion were individual polyps. Basically, a tiny anemone lived in each of those. Coral can grow in a number of different ways. You can actually like trim a piece off and replant it, and usually you can get a second colony of coral that way. They also can breed sexually, so they'll release sperm and eggs into the water column, and then they meet up and then swim around for a while and settle in a new place. So there's a few different ways that corals can grow and create new corals. But in addition to that, they also build upon themselves. Like I said, kind of like Legos, I think is the best way to think about it, because you can start with a few small ones and then continue to add on top of it. So underneath, so it's like this coral skeleton, and then the living tissue is just a relatively thin layer on the outside of that coral skeleton, as you can see in kind of the live corals that we have here.
What's that green stuff growing on the wall?
So those are mushrooms. They're sort of related to corals, maybe like off to the side of corals. Mushroom corals, I guess you call them. And they're kind of nice because they can split and form a new animal. So you can start with just a few, and eventually they'll like take over a larger section of an exhibit or a reef. But just know that in a reef, corals are competing fiercely, even though they don't move. So you don't necessarily think of them as competing. They do things like growing in plates that would shade everything below the coral. Some of them have sweeper tentacles, which are long tentacles that go out into the current and sting everything that tries to grow around them. So they have a lot of different ways to carve out their niche in the reef and create as much space for themselves as they can get.
Can the fish get stung by the coral?
Most of these are hard corals. They have a pretty mild sting, so it would be unusual for the fish to be stung by them. In fact, there's like a little goby kind of hiding in this coral. Hopefully he'll pop up. I just see there. So obviously they're adapted to living in coral, so they have a kind of a mucus layer. So for the mild sting of most of these corals, no. But for some things like some larger anemones, if a fish kind of bumbled in, the anemone would certainly take advantage and sting it and try to eat it. So it kind of depends on the size of the fish and the kind of potency of the coral or anemone's sting. Yeah, there's the little goby popping out there. It's kind of in the shade, so it'll be hard to see, I think.
You can see him. So again, for people who are maybe joining us late, can you tell us why coral is so important? What's its role in its ecosystem?
Well, I mean, for humans, obviously it's beautiful and it's unique, and it supports not only the reefs themselves and creates the reefs themselves, but it also supports a myriad of life around it. So just like our country, the strength of a reef is its diversity. So a little bit of coral supports a whole lot of other things, and all of them work kind of together to carve out their own niches and survive. So I guess it's valuable in and of itself for its own value, but they are valuable for humans as well. They can help reduce the impact of storms on coastlines. So having a strong coral reef and a strong mangrove can help save humans a lot of money, particularly those along the coast. So, and then, I mean, yeah, there's lots of things. Potentially new drugs that could be coming from all the various chemicals that these animals produce. So there's a lot of ways that reefs can be valuable directly and indirectly to humans, absolutely.
How long would it take something like the Great Barrier Reef to form?
Thousands of years. I mean, like I said, I keep going back to the Lego thing, but I mean, you're thinking that eventually everything started off as one tiny little polyp and then kept growing and growing and growing. So it's hard. I think people should realize that, like I said, corals can break and form new colonies, but overall, if you lose a lot at once due to bleaching, that can be hard to recover from. So it's important that we sort of act now to protect these things kind of in perpetuity.
And how delicate are corals? I know
it's very stressful to dive in this exhibit because if you bump them, they can break. So you have to do some crazy yoga moves to not make sure you don't touch them. In addition, if you are snorkeling or diving in an area that is a coral reef, you want to make sure that you are giving corals a lot of space because they are really easy to break. And even if you don't break them, sometimes just touching them can be problematic. And also, if you happen to be snorkeling or diving or even swimming in a place that's near a coral reef, you want to make sure to use sunscreens that are kind of mineral based. A lot of the sunscreens that we have chemicals that can be problematic for corals, so make sure to do a little bit of research on that respect as well.
Yeah, so if you're going to dive near coral reefs, make sure you've got your neutral buoyancy really worked out.
A few corals are actually really potent stingers as well, so you don't want to touch them, if only to not be stung by some of the corals that are stronger stings. Well, thank you very much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed taking a look at our coral reef exhibit. We are very excited to be welcoming you back soon.